Today we're going to zero in on, a really, really pivotal moment in Napoleon Bonaparte's life.
Yeah.
His abdication and that initial exile to the island of Elba, it all went down in April 1814.
Yeah.
So today I think our goal is to really try and pinpoint the most crucial elements of his downfall and exile, and then, what were the main factors that drove it, and then really try and understand the immediate consequences.
I think that's a great plan. It's a real moment where we can see ambition, this seemingly unstoppable force come up against the limits of power.
Right, yeah.
But to really understand the significance of his abdication and exile, I think we need to kind of remind ourselves how high Napoleon had actually climbed.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's set the stage for a second. From, relatively humble Corsican beginnings, Napoleon, he rose through the ranks of the French military like so fast. Like think about the siege of Toulon in 1793.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
this was a really crucial early victory for him. It really put him on the map. And then just a couple years later, in 1795, he was instrumental in putting down royalist uprisings in Paris. And almost overnight, he became this national figure.
Right. Right. It's pretty amazing.
It really is.
And that same trajectory just kept going, right?
Mhm.
Think about the Italian campaign. It kicked off in 1796 against Austria and their allies, and victory after victory after victory there. It cemented this reputation of him as like a military genius.
Right.
What's so fascinating is how he used these military wins, right, to get political power.
Right.
Even the Egyptian and Syrian campaign, mixed results there militarily. It's still, I think it helped his image, right? And I think it shows his ambition.
Totally. Yeah. And those late 1790s, it was just like this rapid ascent. Like he orchestrates the coup of 18 Brumaire in November of 1799, which basically overthrew the existing French directory, right? And he becomes first consul.
Yeah.
And then the Battle of Marengo in 1800, it just totally solidifies French dominance in the War of the Second Coalition, right?
Right.
And then, the culmination of all this, in 1804, he crowns himself Emperor of the French. Like, we're talking about empire building.
Right.
On a massive scale.
Absolutely. An empire built on military might.
Yeah.
But also, this vision he had, right? A unified, French-dominated Europe.
Right. But, history teaches us that even the biggest empires, they can be surprisingly fragile when you stretch them too thin.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
They can for sure.
And if we fast forward a bit, the tide starts to turn so dramatically, right? That 1812 invasion of Russia was a catastrophe. It was like a major, major turning point.
Yeah.
The scale of the losses in men, resources, it decimated his Grande Armée, and it emboldened his enemies all across Europe.
Absolutely. Devastating. Really, it sets the stage for the War of the Sixth Coalition, and then the Battle of Leipzig in October of 1813.
Yeah.
Another just crushing defeat.
Yeah.
These European powers had finally gotten together, united against him, and they were just too strong. And it's not just one battle, right? This was a huge weakening of his military, lost territory, lost alliances. All that constant fighting, it had really drained France itself.
And so with all these defeats piling up, the Allied forces, they start their advance on Paris. Can you paint a picture of those final moments that really led to the abdication?
The pressure was enormous. These coalition armies, they were closing in on the capital. And inside France, support for Napoleon, it was falling apart. Even key figures, close to him, they were starting to see what was coming. The situation in Paris it was becoming impossible. It makes you wonder, considering how brilliant he was strategically, did he have any options left? Or was abdication just inevitable at that point?
It really does feel like, the momentum had totally shifted against him.
Yeah.
And then that formal act of stepping down, it came with the Treaty of Fontainebleau, April 11th, 1814.
Right. This treaty, it was negotiated between Napoleon and these Allied powers.
Yeah.
And it officially ended his reign as Emperor of the French.
Hmm.
And, laid the groundwork for his exile. It was, a formal recognition that things had changed. The political reality in Europe, it was totally different.
Okay. So let's talk about that exile, the move to the island of Elba. Can you walk us through some of the key terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, especially, regarding Napoleon's new, pretty diminished status?
Yeah, what's really striking, I think, is how paradoxical this agreement was. On the one hand, Napoleon, he's forced to give up his title as Emperor of France. Then on the other hand, the treaty makes him the sovereign of Elba. this relatively small Mediterranean island off the coast of Tuscany, like 12,000 people living there.
Right.
It's just this huge contrast
Right.
from ruling this massive European empire to governing this tiny island.
It's incredible.
It seems like maybe this kind of generous offer, it was a way for the Allied powers to get him off the European stage, but maybe they underestimated how restless and ambitious he really was.
Sovereign of Elba. It does kind of feel like a consolation prize, right? After all that power, it really underscores just how dramatic his fall was. But I mean, it does mean he kept some authority, right?
Yeah.
Even if it was limited in this new domain.
Absolutely. He wasn't just a prisoner, right?
Yeah.
He had some autonomy.
Yeah.
But yeah, within a much, much smaller territory. I mean, it must have really messed with him psychologically.
Right. And that leads us to, I mean, a really dramatic personal event, right?
Hmm.
The night after the treaty was signed, Napoleon, he tries to commit suicide.
Yeah.
I mean, this act, I think it really shows like just how deeply this sudden loss of power affected him. The source material says that he used poison that he'd been carrying with him since that retreat from Moscow.
Yeah. Wow.
The fact that he'd held on to it for so long, I mean, it really suggests how much despair he must have been feeling. And then the fact that the poison had weakened and that's why he survived, it just adds this layer of like almost tragic irony, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah.
I mean, it's so hard to understand what must have been going through his mind. This man who had controlled the fate of nations and now he's powerless, like this total loss of identity, the suicide attempt, it just highlights the crushing weight of his circumstances. And, the text also says that his wife and son, they went to Austria for refuge.
Yeah.
That separation must have been another devastating blow for him, right? Like further isolating him.
Totally. Absolutely. Being separated from his family, it would have made that isolation so much worse.
Yeah.
And, really driven home just how complete his downfall was. Like, he wasn't just losing his empire, he was losing his personal connections. The dynasty he'd hoped to build, it was gone.
So he survives this, really desperate act. And the next chapter is the journey to Elba. How did that play out?
Well, he was taken to the island on a British Royal Navy ship, the HMS Undaunted. And he got to Portoferraio, which is the main port on Elba, on May 4th, 1814. That journey, by sea with his former enemies, it must have been a constant reminder of how different his life was now.
Yeah.
Like, it really gives you a tangible sense of his transition into exile.
It does. So he arrives on this small island. What did he actually do there? Was he just resigned to his fate?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The source material says that those first few months on Elba, he really got involved in governing the island. He made plans for administrative reforms, infrastructure projects like road and building construction, and he was trying to make the mines and agriculture on the island better. It seems like that drive, that ambition he was known for, it was still there, even in this much smaller role. It's really interesting, right? This need he had to be in control to make changes, no matter how big or small the stage was.
So even as the ruler of a tiny island, he was still a ruler at his core. I mean, that really tells you something about him. But, the text does mention some limitations on what he could do.
Right. His work was being held back because he didn't have enough money. And that's important because it shows that even as the sovereign of Elba, his power had limits. He didn't have the vast wealth and resources of the French Empire anymore.
Right. And in the midst of all this governing, there were also these personal moments, right? These moments that show the human side of Napoleon, beyond the military leader, beyond the political figure.
Totally. Like, the text says that when he heard that Josephine had died back in France on May 29th, he was devastated. He apparently shut himself in his room for 2 whole days. And that detail, I think it shows the personal cost of his fall from power. It shows how deeply these events outside of politics affected him. It's a powerful reminder that even these huge historical figures, they feel sorrow and loss just like everyone else.
It does. It really humanizes him, from Emperor France to a grieving widower on a small island. And so, considering all of this, it's not really a surprise that he started thinking about escape. What were some of the main things that drove that decision?
Well, there were a few things, I think, that all came together.
Yeah.
I mean, he definitely knew that King Louis VIII was becoming unpopular back in France.
Right.
And that probably gave him some hope that he could go back.
Yeah.
And then realizing that his wife and son weren't going to join him on Elba, that must have made him feel even more isolated, right? And, maybe even less attached to the island. And, they weren't giving him the money they'd promised in the treaty.
Right.
So there were practical problems. And it probably made him resentful. And maybe the most important thing was there were these rumors that they were going to send him to a remote island in the Atlantic.
Oh, wow.
And that would have been it.
Right.
No more hope of ever coming back. So I think all of these things, they created this sense of urgency, like he had nothing to lose by trying to escape.
Right. It was this combination of desperation and opportunity.
Yeah.
Unrest in France, personal isolation, financial problems, and then the threat of being exiled even further. It makes sense that he'd risk everything. So the stage was set for his comeback.
Exactly. On February 26, 1815, less than a year after getting to Elba, Napoleon escaped. He got on this ship, the brig Inconstant, with like 1,000 men and a few other ships. It was bold, and it set in motion the events of the 100 Days, his short final return to power in France.
So let's do a quick recap of our deep dive into this crucial time in Napoleon's life. His abdication in April 1814, it was a direct result of those military defeats, particularly in that War of the Sixth Coalition.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Fontainebleau made it official, right, exiling him to Elba, but also making him the sovereign of the island.
Right.
And then his suicide attempt, I mean, it really highlights the personal crisis that he was going through. His time on Elba, it was this mix of trying to govern and also dealing with huge personal loss, like especially Josephine's death.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it was this combination of things, the unpopularity of the French monarchy, the fear of being exiled again, that made him decide to make that daring escape.
Absolutely. It's this reminder that power and fortune can change so quickly.
Yeah.
Emperor of this huge empire to ruler of a tiny island and then back to being on the run. It all happened so fast.
Yeah. I mean, think about this, right? Napoleon, he redrew the map of Europe. And here he was, ruling a tiny island. Do you think that changed his ambition? Or was Elba just a waiting room for his next move? I mean, he escaped just a few months later. So it seems like it was the latter, right? It makes you wonder, how strong is ambition? I mean, he lost so much, but it didn't go away. And what does that tell us about the people who seek out power? The ones who actually get it. It's a pretty fascinating question.
Yeah, it really is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.